What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Titus, and I really appreciate you coming back and kicking it with me. So, in my last video, we talked about general stats and where all the stat boosts are coming from, and roughly about what those stats mean. But in today's video, we are going to get really deep into how damage works in this game. So, I suggest maybe you go get yourself a drink, get yourself a snack, maybe pull out a little notepad and pen, and I'm going to take you into a journey into math. All right, so starting off, we're back with Kale, and we're going to open up his stats again, right? And so today we're going to be focusing mostly on the attack total. And I've already explained how we get to this total. So, as you can see here, most of your Kales and my Kale are around 2,000 to 3,000, somewhere in that area of attack. But every time you use an ability, it does a lot more than just 2,000-3,000 damage, right? And so why is that? Well, for your viewing pleasure, I have created an entire notepad page filled with all the math that you'll need to understand how your champions are dealing damage and how to prioritize certain stats for them to deal more damage. All right, so as you see here, we have the damage calculation. Now, this entire flow of math is specifically around Kale's A2 and how we get to the damage for our campaign farmer. So, starting off, we have the simple string equation that is actually pretty easy to follow. You're going to start with your first number, the total attack. So for Kale, as you can see underneath, we're starting with 2719. Then immediately afterwards, we hit our first roadblock. See, the first thing that happens to that number is it gets multiplied by the skill multiplier. Now, unfortunately, whether it be through malicious intent, they just didn't really think about it, for whatever reason, Plarium does not give you any of the multipliers for skills. Fortunately, there are sites like Hell Hades that exist that do give us the skill multiplier, and I imagine that this is just data mined information, which, as a side note, if you're one of those people and you're planning on being a developer, don't try to obfuscate information from the community. It never works. You know, you are a person, a small team of person, maybe you're thousands of people, but you're going up against millions of nerds, and millions of nerds, when they really want something, are damn near unstoppable. So what we know from the information on Hell Hades, Kale's A2 has a 4.65 multiplier. So that means that 2719 is immediately being multiplied by 4.65. Then we have the increased damage from books. So what that means is, if you've ever wondered what exactly this means when you book out the damage on an ability, that's what that means. So as you can see here, I have Acid Rain, his A2, fully booked out. And in total, that is giving us a 20% increase to damage. So if I pull this back up, that's how we get to our 1.2. Then we have our crit multiplier. And what that is simply your crit damage, this number right here. Now, I have it written down as 2.13. As you can see, this only says 113. Well, that's because the 100% is essentially a doubling. So when you do the math on this, it would be written out, instead of like this, it would usually be written out something like this. We'll say, well, to put it correctly, it'd be something like that, where you're always adding 1 to whatever the crit damage multiplier is. So that ultimately gives us a 2.13 multiplier. Then we have mastery bonuses. These can be a little bit complicated to understand because not all mastery bonuses apply all the time. For instance, looking at Kale's masteries, I have increased crit damage, of course, but I have a 5% when I'm attacking with full HP. But if I'm not attacking with full HP, I don't have this 5%. I also have 8% increased damage on the first hit for every enemy. So the first time that A2 rains from the sky and hits all of the enemies, I'm going to be getting 8% extra damage on top of that. But the second hits and all subsequent hits will not get this multiplier. We then have not this one, this one. Increased damage by 5% for each slain enemy, stacking up to 10%. So when I'm farming food, if my food doesn't die, I don't get any of these multipliers. Same thing with this one. I'm dealing up to 12% increased damage for every enemy I kill, which means on the first stage, I won't get this 12%. And on subsequent stages, I will have the full percentage. Maybe, depending on how many kills Kayle gets during a wave, which if he's campaign farming is stacked up pretty much immediately. So what I've done is I've just kind of taken an aggregate of all the best case scenarios, and that is an extra 35% total of damage, which is written at 1.35. So if you just work left to right and you do all the math, we come out with 43,000 damage, which seems pretty on brand for what I've seen Kayle do when he's campaign farmer, but it doesn't end there. Something else that I had cut out from the first equation is this chain continues. We then add affinity bonuses. Now, if you're not entirely sure about how affinity bonuses is or how affinity bonuses work, apparently I don't know how words work, I've written them down for you below. So if we're in an affinity matchup and it's neutral, which means Kayle's magic, if we're hitting a magic or void champion, there are no bonuses, this number stays the same. If we have a good affinity, well, the first thing that we get innately is a 15% extra chance to crit, which means that your crit damage can come down a little bit if you are, say, again, playing Kayle and doing 12-3, where almost every single champion aside from one in the first wave is a positive matchup. As you can see with my Kayle, I have 82% crit chance, and it's a little bit higher for his A2, but I'm still technically under crit cap. But when I'm hitting spirit champions, I have 100% crit, which is, as my campaign farmer, that's all I care about. I also get a 30% chance to strong hit, and when I do strong hit, I get a 30% increase to damage or a 1.3 multiplier. So the way the equation changes is it's all the same up until we get to affinity. And if I land a strong hit, I go from 43,000 damage to 56,000 damage. So quite a bit better. Unfortunately, there's also bad affinity matchups. That one champion in the first wave of 12-3, I have watched Kayle get multiple weak hits in a row, and the equation changes as so. When you're in a bad affinity matchup, you always do 20% less damage, flat, regardless if you weak hit or not. You then get a 35% chance to weak hit, and a chance of skill landing crit is less than 50 or 15% lower. So even if you're crit capped at 100%, if you're in a bad affinity matchup, you're technically hitting them with 85% crit. When a weak hit occurs, you deal an additional 30% damage, less damage, which means in total, when you weak hit, you're dealing 50% less damage to that enemy than you normally would be, and debuffs can't be applied. So I've written it out as so. If you're just in a bad affinity matchup, we change out the 1.3 for 0.8, and we get to about 35,000 damage. If we hit them and we weak hit, we come all the way down to 21,000. And for this, I haven't factored in the idea that you could also miss out on your crit multiplier, which would make these numbers come down even further. So as you can see, affinity matchups are very important in this game, especially in PvP. If you're building teams for PvP, Understanding champions that you're going to see very often and trying to get good affinity matchups is key to climbing. Then, after we've factored in affinity, we come to passives. Now, I've written a separate tab for passives, and I brought over the equation from earlier. So there are some passives in the game that give you flat increases to damage. The one example I gave is Bad El-Khazar. He has a passive where him and all allies deal 20% increased damage if the enemy has a poison debuff. So, assuming that the target has a poison debuff and it is a good affinity matchup, the equation now looks like this. Base stat, skill multiplier, the increased damage from books, the crit damage, the masteries, the affinity matchup, and the passive from Bad El-Khazar, and we get to 68,000 damage as opposed to the 56,000 damage that we had accumulated from having a good affinity matchup. So as you can see, as you begin stacking things, this is why if you watch any other content creators or watch any videos on Raid and you see people hitting for millions of damage, but yet their champion only has a base attack of 7,000, this is now starting to show how you get from 7,000 to a million. So trying to stack as many things in your favor for your damage dealers is crucial for getting through mid and later stages of dungeons and other things like that. Now, we get to the most complicated portion of this video, and that is defense calculation. Yes, that's right, because all of this damage would only happen if the enemy you were hitting had no defense to speak of. Unfortunately for you, in a scenario where you're hitting somebody, they're going to have defense that reduces the damage by certain percentages. So, I'll put it up on the screen, but we have a defense calculation chart. Now, I do like math, but I also like convenience, and so if somebody else has already done the math for me, I'm not going to try and reinvent the wheel. So, let's get into that. All right, getting to now the most complicated portion of this, the defense calculation. And I know it's complicated because I've had to reshoot this like 4 times because it's very easy in all of this math and talking to trip over myself, and that just starts to look really awkward after a while. So, on screen, I'm going to put up a defense chart. This defense chart shows you roughly at what point of the number of defense you have, whatever your defense number is, next to that, how much damage is actually getting through. So if you look on the chart at 4240, that 20 next to the semicolon, that's telling you that only about 20% of the actual hit is coming into your health pool, and the other 80% is being mitigated or essentially being tossed into the void. So using this chart, we're going to use 4200. I rounded down a little bit. We'll just say 4200, about 80% damage reduction. And we're going to plug those numbers in moving forward. So if we take the 68,000 from the previous equation where we had passives and all that stuff stacked up, what we have now is we take that and we multiply it by the 0.2 or 20% of the damage that's actually going through to our target. And what we find is 68,000 becomes 13.6 thousand very quickly, which is unfortunate because what should be a big hit suddenly becomes a much smaller hit. Now, this is why most anybody will tell you that stacking buffs on yourself and stacking debuffs on the enemy are crucial. Because if we take just the 3 standards that we see a lot of, 50% increased attack, 60% decreased defense, and 25% weaken, we come to our next equation. We start with the 2719 of Kael's attack. We begin adding the bonuses, but the first one we add is the increase attack, which is a 1.5. Because what increase attack does is it takes your total attack stat, not the base, and increases it by 50%. hence the 1.5. We then continue through the string as normal, except the only differences I've made is if you see where I have ×1 and ×1, in this equation specifically, I'm assuming that you have a neutral hit and you are not stacking any passives whatsoever. We then get to 0.44. Now, where does the 0.44 come from? Well, if you take 4,200 and you decrease it by 60%, what you find is the second number is 1680. If you refer back to the chart, what you see is that 1680, which doesn't show on the chart, but if we roughly kind of figure out where it sits, it means that now 44% of the damage rather than 20% of the damage is getting through. We then multiply that by 1.25, and the 1.25 is the weaken. It is the last thing in the equation, because all weaken says is if you are under a 25% weaken, whatever hit happens after all other calculations, they are taking an increased 25% of that. And what we have now is that this string comes out to 35,992. So about 36,000 damage, which is much better than the 13,000, even taking away passives and good affinity matchups. Well, we can do one better. On this very bottom equation, what you see is I have a 0.54 instead of a 0.44. But I haven't changed the buffs or debuffs. So what have I changed? Well, if you put your champion in a 4-piece Savage set, the passive on that set says your champion ignores 25% of the enemy's defense. And so what we have now is 1680 then becomes 1260. And according to the chart, 1260 exists somewhere between 55 and 50% incoming damage. So essentially, I just kind of eyeballed it and put 54%, which is 0.54. We're also keeping all of the other buffs and debuffs the same, and our final number is 44,000. And as you can see, just adding 3 things, an increased attack and 2 debuffs to an enemy makes our damage go from 13,000 with other benefits to 44,000 without those benefits. And to make it all consistent, I'm going to add back in those benefits and I'll give you the final equation. So as you can see, we added back in all of the previous affinity matchups and passives, and we kept all of the debuffs and the the ignored defense, where we got the 0.54, multiplied it by the weakened debuff, and what we find is at the very end, it's 45,000. So as you can see, bringing decreased defense and weaken is actually more important for dealing damage than passives and affinity matchups. So that's something to consider when building out your team. Ooh, man, that was a lot of math. I hope I didn't put you guys to sleep too bad, but I wanted everyone watching this video to understand how damage is being calculated, because while I think it's okay to fall back on, free calculators online on the Hell Hades website, I mean, I myself use them all the time. I also think it's important to understand where this is coming from, so that if you think you can math it out better to be more optimal in your damage dealing or in your defense, then, it's like G.I. Joe always said, knowledge is half the battle. Yeah, that's what he said, right? Anyway, that's all from me, guys. I've been Titus. I really appreciate you coming around. If you liked the video, let me know with a like, subscribe, comment maybe, let me know how I did, all that fancy YouTube stuff. And I will see you guys next time.